A very good evening to everyone, and it is our great pleasure today to welcome Samik Bandyopadhyay for delivering this talk at our department. So, a very warm welcome to Sir, and thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us online, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. So, a warm welcome to everyone on behalf of ISA Bhopal, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. So, our speaker today absolutely needs no introduction, but I will still give a brief introduction here by reading out the very brief bio note that Sir has sent us. So Samik Bandyopadhyay, of course, is a veteran academic, editor, publisher, translator, lexicographer, film, theatre, and art critic. He has a degree in literature from the University of Calcutta, and he subsequently joined Rabindra Bharati University as a lecturer and then went on to hold several prestigious posts in various academic institutions across the globe, including the Rabindranath Tagore National Fellow at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU, New Delhi. He was also the ICCR chair at the Department of Theatre Studies, Frey University, Berlin, vice chairman of the National School of Drama from 2006 till 2010. In 1973, he joined the Oxford University Press as the regional editor of Kolkata. He was the founding editor of Seagull and Thema Publishers. He is the founding member of the Natya Sodh Sansthan, a theatre archive, library and resource center in Kolkata. And he has participated in numerous panels and events across the world on Indian theatre as part of festivals. In USSR, in Germany, he has served as the producer emeritus for All India Radio and Doordarshan, and he is widely known in the entire field of film and theatre, and in general in art criticism in Kolkata, throughout the country, and outside the country as well. He has contributed prolifically through his essays, translations, reviews, and commentaries in Frontline film and theatre periodicals, books, and journals. He has interviewed stalwarts like Satyajit Ray, Mrinal Sen, Shambhu Mitro, Utpal Dutt, Badal Sarkar, Mohshita Devi, and others, Salman Rushdie, Richard Attenborough, among others. He has also written an introduction to the collection of Vijay Tendulkar's plays published by OUP India. This is a very brief note of Samik's huge list of achievements, and it is a great pleasure to have you here. Welcome, and I'd like to thank my former colleague, Dr. Nimi Bhattacharya, for facilitating this and for arranging this talk with you. So thank you, sir, for being here. And I'll hand over to you. And I'll make a few housekeeping announcements. If everybody could please keep your microphone muted and your video off while the speaker speaks. And at the end of the talk, when we go to the question and answer and the discussion session, if you could please type down your questions by using the chat window. We will then take questions from the chat window and we will moderate the Q&A session. So over to you, sir. You have 45 minutes and you can talk for as long as that if you wish, or if you wish to keep it a bit shorter, and then we can have an interaction discussion session.
Thank you. It's ironic that we're talking about theatre at a point of time when theatre in practice is in limbo. Theatre is an act in a community. There has to be the give and take of theatre, and that makes it theatre. And without that, without the immediate presence of an audience and the direct physical, verbal, vocal interaction between the audience and the theatre in performance, there can be no theatre. Still, we can wait for theatre to revive. Theatre has had such problems, situations, crises in history more than once, and theatre has come back again. So waiting till theatre comes back, maybe it's time to talk about theatre and sort out our ideas about theatre. I have a very limited scope this afternoon. I'll be talking about what we call modern Indian theatre. And we can't cover the entirety of modern Indian theatre. It is such a complex and rich and wonderful experience, an experience through which I have lived and shared intensively for more than 60 years now. So all that I can do is to provide a kind of a cultural background, a cultural history to modern Indian theatre. How this theatre emerged, and I would say not so much emerged, how this theatre reinvented itself post-independence. And that is the narrative that I would like to address. For all practical purposes, we inherited theatre not from our own past so much, modern theatre, I mean, as from the colonial education system. So it was around the mid-19th century that we discovered theatre. At a point of time when the colonial rulers of the country were interested in creating spaces where they could be regulated, controlled, but some interactivity between the colonized and the colonizers. And as part of the education system, which was planted in India by the colonial rulers around the middle of the 19th century, and if you go by dates, 1856 was the year, 56, 57 was the year of the first Indian War of Independence. And it was in 1857 that India had its first 3 universities in the colonial period: Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. These 3 were the entry points of the colonial rulers, and they were interested in consolidating their position, their power, their authority, and their administrative reach from these 3 points. And these were all coastal towns, and they had entered India by sea at these 3 sites. And they wanted to consolidate the power in these 3 points very specifically. And that is why all the 3 cities had, right at the beginning of the colonial entry, their own forts. The colonials were scared of the situation in the country. And if they had to run away, they could hide themselves in the fort for some time and then set sail. So they were taking all the precautions. It was part of this precautionary politics, even as forces, diverse forces in the country, were consolidating against colonial rule, as evident in the explosion of 1857, the First War of Independence, that they felt the need also to consolidate culturally, so that there could be a dialogue, there could be an exchange, there could be negotiations. It was necessary that the English language and the culture that had grown around the language should be given to the Indians so that there could be a common table of understanding. And that's why it became important to set up the universities, a whole education system. For the first 2, 3 decades, these three universities were not teaching institutions directly. They administered education. But in the administration, they came to control the entire content, style of education from the lowest units, the primary units in the villages, in the small towns, up to the top in the big cities, in the metropolises. It was the administration of education that was the job of the universities, while actual education happened in the schools and colleges, but controlled by the universities. And as part of this education system, the best way, the content of a culture, the spirit of a culture could be conveyed to people in another culture, in another setting, would be drama. So drama became a major component. The English play became a major component in the educational content that was imparted in these institutions from the three universities. And that's how Shakespeare comes in, the other British playwrights come in. Initially, not so much for independent theatre practice by Indians, but more to convey that feel of the culture, to convey the subtle continuities in the history of a nation as they come through in their plays over times. When people living in a time speak the language of the time, they speak the history of the time also. And that's how the plays come in. And if you enact the plays, if you speak the plays, try to live the plays in your actions, in your practice, you participate in that other culture, in the different foreign culture. And that becomes a contact, interactive point. That's how theatre comes in initially, as a teaching method, as a teaching tool, as a teaching space. But as the creative spirit in India starts responding to these texts and the theatric practices that the texts seem to carry, bear with them, a theatre emerges. But unfortunately, the theatre that came with these texts was a dull, dreary, dead kind of theatre. In Britain, 18th century theatre was a far drift away from the great period of Shakespeare and his contemporaries in the 16th century. What had happened in the meantime was that in the 18th century, with the rise of capitalism, with the accumulation of resources looted from the whole of the world for industrial appropriation and production, what had happened was that capitalism was rising and getting entrenched in Britain. Anybody could invest something and make a lifetime's prosperity out of that. So the actors started feeling for the first time in the 18th century, well, they too had a capital that they could invest, a capital at two levels, virtually. The capital of their reputation, their popularity among the people for whom they acted, and also the money that they had accumulated from their career. They decided to invest it. And in the 18th century, for the first time, we find actors investing in the theatre business and the theatre industry, buying up a large share or part of the theatre where he performed, so that he becomes what is called, a new term comes into being, a hyphenated term, actor manager. The actor himself owned the theatre. He was the manager. He was in charge of it. And theatre became a space where he would project himself. He would show his skills. He would use everything he had to draw the audience, to ensure that they came to see him, not anything else. He turned the plays into playgrounds that he could prune, tear, break, do whatever he likes with the text, as long as he could project himself. And he knew that people were buying tickets to see him and nothing else. In the process, the totality of theatre, the running communion that happens when a theatre is in performance between the audience and the performance, all that cracked and were in a shambles. It was an awes reverential audience adoring the star performer. And nothing else mattered. That was the theatre tradition that dominated British theatre in the 18th, 19th centuries entirely. It had to wait till the end of the 19th century, at the turn into the 20th, when a strong criticism led by George Bernard Shaw emerged, attacked these actors. Shaw, at one point, describing them as a tribe of empty-headed impersonators. No actors at all. And from this criticism, there emerged only in the early 20s a new British theatre sensibility, I would say, that looked at theatre again as a field of exchange, emotions, ideas, responses, where the actors, as an ensemble, as a team, performed the play. And they were not just human performers, human players. They created the imagery out of the words, made them visible in the design of the stage, in the illumination, in the throw of the sounds. All these things cohered, came together, and created a total theatre. But in India, for a long time, we remained captive to the charm and the magic and the immediate kick, I would say, not even the thrill, of the performance. India needed to find its modernism, to find a modern theatre only in the 1940s. For till then, theatre had been at one level an entirely urban business, a small community, a small class of those who worked for the British colonial system, the newly emerging middle class in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, the three focal points of colonial power. Delhi was nowhere in the scene in the second half of the 19th century. Delhi would become Delhi only in 1911 when the national capital was shifted from Calcutta to Delhi. And a whole new city starts growing on the ruins of old Mughal Delhi. It is in the 1940s when it was clear historically that the colonial era is on its way out. Things would change, independence would come along. Not entirely from the energies generated in the national movement, but also, maybe more, because of the trend of things happening in the world. The First World War had already cracked the strength of British colonial power considerably, and more was to come. So Britain was already planning to, thinking of, leaving the colonies, giving them partial independence initially, then full independence. And there was time for the first time in the 1940s, early 1940s, to think about an independent India with its independent culture. So long as the national movement continued, that was in focus. That was the primary concern. And everything else, the politics of gender, the politics of the working classes, the peasantry, the tribals, culture, all these had been just pushed underneath the carpet with the focus entirely on how do we get our freedom. And everything else can wait till freedom comes. In the 40s, this sense of things changing, the need for modernization in thinking at one level, and also every country in the world, India included, thanks to the First World War, the first world war ever in the history of the world, that India becomes aware of history, geography, anthropology, a whole world which had been beyond our reach, beyond our curiosity. And with that comes a feel for culture, the need for culture. And one of the first provocations that led to the emergence of a new Indian theatre, a modern Indian theatre, sadly, strangely, was a terrible famine, a man-made famine, a state-made famine in Bengal in 1943-44. The British government was hoarding food for their soldiers with the thought that the war was going to continue and food would be needed. So people were denied food in the villages, food stocked in reserve for the soldiers fighting at the front. And the war had come in 1941, 42, 43, quite close to India. Japanese bombers had bombed Calcutta twice, parts of what is now Bangladesh several times, across the border with then Burma, now Myanmar. The Indian National Army, led by Subhas Bose, and the Japanese had crossed the borders and come into Manipur. So the war had come close, and the colonial rulers were hoarding for the war. And a terrible famine where, according to official reports, 3 million people died of starvation. And a large number of them died on the streets of Calcutta. They'd come from the interior, from the villages, in the hope that there would be food, there would be sustenance in the city at least. The city wasn't prepared in any way. Neither were the authorities to take care of that crisis. Thousands of people died in the streets of Calcutta. And it was a journalist, poet, singer, story writer, Bijun Bhattacharya, who had no special interest in theatre, didn't care much about the theatre that was current then, the theatre in the old British colonial mode, centering on heroic figures drawn from mythology or history, artificially larger than life, with no reality, with no intensity within. He was not interested in it. And as he told me once, on his way to office, he worked for a newspaper those days, he had to pass by an empty space, sort of a park, where about 30 families from the villages had taken shelter under the sky in utter destitution. And Bhattacharya told me, when reminiscing about those days, how he felt so ashamed that he never looked at them. Every day he passed them, he would keep his eyes glued to the ground in shame, as he told me. Till one day, he heard a couple. He didn't look at them. He heard a couple talking about the New Year's harvesting times the previous year, the year before the famine, and what great fun it had been. People who were going to die any day were talking about happiness, lost happiness, destroyed happiness, but even memories, treasured memories, brought them relief from the immediate horror that they faced. And 3 days later, as he passed the same point, he saw a dead body covered in a ragged piece, and it suddenly struck him. Maybe. He was not sure. Maybe. It was the man who was talking the other day. And he felt deep within himself that their voices should be heard. They can't be allowed to die like that. And a man who had never written a play, a man who'd never cared about theatre, but loved songs, was a lyricist in his own right, a composer, a story writer with a rich stock of human experiences, of traveling throughout the place. All that was there. But suddenly life was becoming theatrical, demanding a theatrical voice, a theatrical articulation. And he wrote his first play, Navanna. In a shorter version, it was translated in Hindi and traveled throughout India to raise funds. It had been produced by the Indian People's Theatre Association, a new organization of performance artists and writers coming together, looking forward to, imagining a new culture at the end of the tunnel. And when Bhattacharya decided to direct the play, his first directorial venture, he decided that he could not act, he could not perform this play with actors spoiled by the conventions and practices of what, quite deridingly, their generation called the commercial theatre. A theatre to sell, a theatre not to think and create and respond. A new theatre needed its own actors and actresses who'd come into theatre with a different sensibility. And one of the actors that he chose was a relation of his, an actress, Tripti Mitra, who later turned out to become one of India's foremost actresses, a legendary actress. And Tripti Mitra would share with me her memories of how she was still a student in a college. And in those days in Calcutta, colleges, several colleges, had a women's department in the morning and a men's department for the afternoon. So she was in the morning department. She went back home and she watched day after day another similar group of destitute women and children just facing her house, opposite her house, in a small clearing. And every day, when lunch was being cooked in her place, it was a home where a number of families lived together, a kind of a joint, collective family, a big family. So when the rice was cooked, the watery waste was poured down the pipe to come down to the drain by the street. And she watched how the women from the clearing opposite would bring their little bowls down to the pipe through which the waste, the rice waste, flowed into the drain. And before it could hit the drain, they would collect it in the bowls. That was food, the only food that they could afford. This had become quite a regular feature, a piece of drama. The drama that Bandyopadhyay had seen, talking about lost happiness and then death. A different kind of drama. When one afternoon, a mother and 3 children, they had rushed up to the point and collected their rice water. And as the 3 little girls grappled with the mother, she harshly pushed them away violently and drank up the entire water as the 3 little children shocked into silence. They didn't cry. They just wondered and stared at the mother's cruelty. Only when she had almost finished it, she realized what she had done. And she was in tears. She called the children back to her. They surrounded her, and she could only weep. Triptimitu recalled yet another experience when, in the afternoons, a group of students had come together, made a kind of a relief group, and they would be serving food, some sort of a gruel with vegetable pickings shoved in, to a group of about 30 women every afternoon. And one day, as she was serving, she noticed one of the waiting women had something eerie about her looks. She left her bowl down, walked up, stretched out her arm, and the woman fell on her arm and passed away. So Tripti Mitra would later tell me, when she performed in Nirvana, she was not only trying to pass the horror, the shame, the pain of these experiences to her audience, put that into the core of her acting, but also hoping to move the audience to a point where at the end of the show, when they made collections for the relief camp, they would be more generous. So theatre and life were getting combined in a very different way from the commercial parameters, from the capitalist ethos of the colonial theatre that we had inherited. This was one beginning. In Calcutta, in Bengal, there was another kind of beginning in Bombay, where obviously these horrors did not physically hit Bombay ever. The industrial capital a much more affluent, richer space. And post-independence, even just before independence in the 40s, when Nabanda was happening in Bengal and realism was being reinvented. New directors, post-independence, facing the reality, an extremely complex, problematic reality, with the hangover of the communal riots that broke up India still hanging. And the expectations of immediate happiness, more employment, etc., that had been there in the air, not being realized. The frustrations. But all these had to be expressed in a realistic theatre where ordinary men, common men, found their voices, found their bodies in interaction on the stage, could share with it. In Bombay, it was a different trajectory, where with industrialization growing, with capital asserting itself in a different way, a different kind of modernism emerges. The entire early 20th century European dramatic experience, where realism predominated, the reality of domestic relationships and the cracks in the domestic relationships, the working class, the labor class, distinctions of class, the majorities and the minorities in society. These are new realities which had never been addressed in theatre. These come into play, and the models throughout the 40s and into the 50s are, of course, European. Because the colonial tradition in India, or the old tradition, the tradition of the Natya Shastra, these were far too remote from this reality. And there was, in the way India had developed in the colonial period politically, there had been such a strong divide between the cities and the interiors, rural interiors, forest interiors, tribal interiors, that there was a massive curtain of ignorance holding out, leaving out local traditions, communities, regional communities, sub-regions within regions, with the different environments, different local histories, having their own performances. And mark one thing, when we talk of performances and theatre, we need to make a distinction. Theatre, modern theatre as we know it, is a theatre which starts from the word, from the text. Then you play it out, you speak it, you perform it, you build out of it, images out of it. But the core is the text, words. But performance is a larger area of experience where music, dance, words, anything, any kind of performance, any part of the body playing, that can be the takeoff point. That can be the trigger. And for a long time, all over the world, it was performance that dominated. Theatre came to be distinguished from it, drawn away from it, much later in the 18th century, when the demarcations, theatre, music, dance, they were introduced, defined, clarified, and the different forms started asserting and identifying themselves. So it was only post-50s that after this first phase of modern Indian drama had come into its own through importing foreign models, recasting them in new parameters, locating them in our country, in our reality. And then, after a sense of exhaustion had come into this, a reaching out to the more traditional original forms. And a whole opening up of the scenario starts happening in the mid-60s. And we have to stop here, maybe. We have exhausted our time. But it's important to underscore the point that from 1947 to 1964, the political vision had been defined, at least for the cultural community, the intelligentsia, the thinking, teaching, writing, painting people, by Jawaharlal Nehru. And in 1664, when Nehru passes away, there is a sense of terrible frustration. It was not just his death, but somehow all the visions that he had held forth, they seemed to collapse. And with the realization that very little of that vision had been realized actually. So in a way, the first new Indian play that was widely staged in different Indian languages in the late 60s happened to be Tughlaq by Girish Karnad, written in Kannada, then translated into English by Girish himself, and from English into several Indian languages. And a whole new generation of directors, they emerged on the scene. And beginning with Tughlaq, which Girish would say was not so much about Tughlaq as about Nehru, an impractical visionary. A whole body of new plays emerged in the mid-60s, between 65 and 75. A whole generation of new playwrights, Girish Karnad in Kannada, Vijay Tendulkar in Marathi, Mohan Rakesh and Dharamveer Bharati in Hindi, Badal Sarkar in Bangla, and directors like B.V. Karant in Kannada, Satyadev Dubey in Hindi and Marathi, Arvind Deshpande in Marathi, Jabbar Patel in Marathi, Ajitish Banerjee, Bibhas Chakrabarti, Arun Mukherjee, Badal Sarkar in Bangla, a whole new renaissance of Indian theatre erupts. And what is most striking is that the new modernity that was redefined, recast between 65 and 75 was a modernity that recognized the different cultural histories, the different modes of sensibilities in different regions in India, the ease with which a Marathi play could be translated and done in Bangla, or a Bangla play could be done in Marathi. This became the culture, the new culture of the modern Indian theatre. I think that's a point where we could stop because that is another beginning.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very comprehensive overview of the main currents and trends in both colonial Indian theatre and early theatre in independent India. And with that, I would invite the audience for their questions and comments, and I would request my colleague Dr. Anuparna Mukherjee to take over from here and moderate the question and answer session. Anuparna?
Thank you, Anpura. And so, could you please type your questions while you're gathering your thoughts? So, once again, I would wish to thank the department. It's such a rich and comprehensive journey across, time, one big sweep, but at the same time retaining all the nuances, the colonial to the modern, and then post-colonial intersectionality of so many
Anuparna, sorry, you're a bit faint. So yeah, it's better now.
Is it better?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry for that. So once again, yes, I would like to thank on behalf of the department for the fact that weaving together such a rich and very, very journey and bringing these very complex terms of the
Yeah, it's just fading out. Again, we lost you. Yeah, this is better. So if you could, is it the position of the microphone?
Is it all right now?
Yeah, it's fine now.
Yes.
Thanks. Sorry.
Sorry for that. So I'm waiting for the questions. So in the meantime, I was just trying to kind of recollect the journey that we had today from theatre as a tool for colonial dissemination of colonial knowledge, and then how modern theatre kind of came in, which is informed by international sensibilities, but at the same time there was an immediacy which was brought in by the famine, and then the watershed event almost that happened with Navanno, followed by the partition and then post-colonial, very complex post-colonial reality, which is informed by so many other factors, and then of course playwrights like Karnad coming in, Karnad, Karan, Bay, Oditesh coming in formation, and we of course looked at the breakdown of the star system and the birth of the group theatre in a certain sense. So many things. So I would like to invite our audience to kind of put their questions together in the chat box. Go ahead. Okay, so while we're waiting for the first question, maybe Dantika, can I ask the first question while we're waiting for people to kind of put together their thoughts?
So yeah, Anuparna, I didn't get that.
So we are waiting for the questions to come in. So in the meantime, can I begin, have the prerogative of asking the first question?
Sure. I also have a brief question and I'll follow you.
Okay, thank you. So Sir, my question would be, of course, you kind of delineated the importance of the, the famine in bringing in a certain change in the theatrical, in the theatrical scene. But my question is, what about partition? Why was kind of partition, in a certain sense, sidelined, given that it was also a very momentous event that kind of changed the cultural life of Bengal? And also, if you could tell us very briefly about the breakdown of IPTA, after the famine, post-independence years, in the post-independence years, the reason for the breakdown of IPTA.
So there are two questions. The first one, partition. Now that remains a problematic thing, as you know that the partition has not been, as far as Bengal is concerned, the partition has not been addressed even in literature. And even in films, it is only Ritik Khattak who brought the partition in, but more as a kind of a sentimental sense of loss rather than the partition in all its impact, the power of its impact in so many different ways. The same applies to theatre, partition in theatre. I have a feeling, it's a tentative kind of an answer, and I'm not giving it as a final thing, that the experience of partition was something that those who were affected by the partition, in very realistic social historical terms, wanted to forget it, move it away, and get into the mainstream, identify with the mainstream, find their place in the mainstream. So this became so much the social dynamics of the period that, but for very few exceptions, of course, there was a play called Notun Yehudi, which brought to the forefront quite a number of actors who'd be leading figures in Bengali theatre. It would become a film immediately after that, Notun Yehudi. But there was Bastu Bhita, which was produced by the IPTA. But these are exceptions because the tendency, the social tendency was for the people who came over from Eastern Bengal would rather like to put that away and identify with the mainstream, find their place, and find a new way of living. So in that tendency, the partition somehow got completely displaced. That's my explanation, a tentative explanation. The IPTA breakdown, one should remember, one should take it into account, that in 1948, the IPTA and the Communist Party were banned. But an underground IPTA continued who performed, who did shows in dangerous, risky situations. And some of the actors and singers, particularly, who took a very active role in this period of the IPTA, included people like Karuna Banerjee, who did the lead in Potet Panchali later on, Kali Banerjee, Reba Roy Chaudhary, did a heroic role in the banned IPTA. Nothing like this has happened anywhere in India in terms of direct performance. In states of emergency or powerful state censorship, written materials get circulated. But when you're performing in public, in the presence of a crowd, of a community, it's a different scene altogether. That continued. In 1951, after the ban had been lifted, the IPTA was revived in Bengal, in other parts of India also. But what happened was that the politics of performance had changed. The concept of what in Bengal came to be called the group theatre, that emerged, in which there would be a single director with almost dictatorial authority who would lead a group with very little internal democracy. And they would perform non-professionally, making their living from elsewhere, but doing theatre with a commitment, with a great commitment. And so this became the new mode of theatre. So the collectivity, the common social concerns for theatre that IPTA had defined, these were just demolished. So it was a different mode altogether which came in, and that became so widely accepted and popular till very recently. Now there is a shift coming in again, where this non-professional experimental theatrical mode is being critiqued and challenged and questioned by another group of theatre workers who think that theatre should be totally professionalized, and they would like to describe theatre as company theatre. So there would be theatre companies. The entire commercial setup of the late 19th century, 18th, 19th centuries, a kind of a revival of that, of course, in new capitalist terms.
Anuparna, your voice is off.
Sorry. Thank you so much, sir. So we would sort of request Antara to articulate her question, maybe.
Okay, thank you. And so I have a couple of questions on which I would invite your thoughts. One is about, so you mentioned this rural-urban divide and how there were no or little traces of local cultures or cultural practices in the kind of urban theatre that developed in these colonial centers of Calcutta, Bombay and Madras initially, and also after independence. So my first question is, by when do we see this being displaced, or who were the first proponents in whose work we see amalgamation or the influence of other kinds of local forms or other kinds of performances? By when do we see them entering the space of the urban theatre in India? This is one. And my second question is that you started with the thought that right now in this pandemic-induced crisis that we are in, theatre is in a limbo. And I was just curious to know, again, two parts of this question. One is if you could share your thoughts on some of the ways in which theatre is adapting to this current crisis through such modes like digital theatre, for instance. What would be your thoughts on these new modes of theatre practice which are being enforced upon us by this situation? And the other is that you talked extensively of the famine and how that was one of the big triggers for the kind of theatre that emerged later with Bijon Bhattacharya and so on. And thinking about COVID and the pandemic, the situation now, also makes me wonder about earlier pandemics in the colonial time, for instance, like the plague or the Spanish flu that we had. And I was wondering about what kind of impact they had on theatre at that point of time? Is there anything that we have now which shows those impacts? Like, of course, we have of the famine.
Okay.
So these were my questions. Thank you.
So as far as the first question is concerned about the new linkages, new sharing between the urban and the rural, the city and beyond the city. Now, it's a long history that begins almost to the point where I ended the 65-75 period, when a whole new group of directors and playwrights appear on the scene, and a lot of sharing beyond the state or the linguistic borders. And that naturally spills over also into the interiors, into the rural, tribal areas. The most striking figures, of course, in this whole fresh opening up of the space would, of course, be Habib Tanveer, who, very interestingly, again, if you read Habib Tanveer's autobiography, which came out uh, late in his life, uh, for a long time, a man who was born in Raipur, grew up there in Chhattisgarh, and a very rich cultural area in terms of several balladic traditions, short, small theatre traditions, a lot of these abounding in Chhattisgarh. Habib grew up completely oblivious of all these experiences. And even when he leaves Chhattisgarh to come to Nagpur to study, to do his graduation, he thinks, as he very frankly admits in his autobiography, that he was looking forward to going to Bombay and join the Bombay cinema. He photographed himself in studios, in local studios, and sent off the snapshots to directors, production firms in Bombay. He came to Bombay after his graduation and hovered around the cinema circles, made friends there, hoped to be doing something there, didn't make it, went off to Delhi, started doing theatre, but with nothing of Chhattisgarh about it. It was much later when he goes to Britain, hoping to do theatre studies there at the RADA. The entire perspective was different. Chhattisgarh didn't exist for him till then. There he gets exposed to Brecht, the tremendous impact of Brecht in the late 50s all over Europe. And somehow he can't find anything in Indian theatre, in the urban practices of Indian theatre, that could give him the liberating element in Brecht, who can go into music, who can go into common jokes, into a very kind of a popular, theatrical, performative world. The play bursts into these areas, breaks into these areas. Somehow he couldn't get anything, get any parallel in India, till he goes back to Raipur then from Delhi while he was doing Agra Bazaar. And for the first time, much later in his life, he discovers the Nacha group, these small traveling groups of wonderful actors. And first, for his Agra Bazaar, his second Agra Bazaar production in Delhi, he brings some of them over. And he very frankly tells us that it was more to bring some spice into it. And then the spice takes over. So they become the flavor, they become everything. And in Charandas Chor and some of the major productions, his greatest ones, works like Bahadur Kalarin particularly, he was depending totally on them. He would provide them with a bare storyline sometimes even draw on their stories and enrich them. I remember back in 1973 or 4, the first time he was performing in Calcutta, I interviewed him, and he said, he used the term, he said, I'm an interventionist. I'm just intervening in their work and adding something to it. I let them go. So Habib's was a major intervention, is his word, in this shift. But then something comes up more prominently and brilliantly, is again in the 70s, in that period, the 65-75 period, that we discover Manipur. And these two great directors, Ratan Thiam and Haisam Kanhalal, who bring the entire Manipuri experience and a very rich, complex experience, the Manipuri cultural experience. And in one of Ratan's plays, great plays, Nine Hills, One Valley, he talks about the 9 hills with the 9 different Naga tribes with their 9 different cultures. And the valley, which has its own culture, the Meitei culture, and which had been virtually supplanted by the Vaishnava culture from Bengal at one point of time. The coexistence, the subtle tensions, and also the mixages of the Meitei culture, the pre-Vaishnava culture, and the Vaishnava culture, and the Naga tribal cultures. It is such a rich storehouse. And out of that, what great plays and productions they have done, which is completely away from the mainstream Indian theatre traditions or the Western oriented, Western inspired reinventions that the mainstream Indian theatre has done. So a great opening up. There are other directors who have also worked along these lines, but the 3 giants would be Habib, Kanhailal, and Ratan.
So we have another question which is actually related to Antara's first question. Should we take that, Antara, and then we can go back to the second question?
Yeah,
So
sure,
here,
sure.
yeah.
So I just wanted to thank sir for that brilliant, it just seems like a masterclass in the history of Indian theatre. So thank you so much for that, taking us through all of these phases.
And could I add a word? So if you're looking at my question, Anuparna, I think he answered it better than I could have articulated that question. So mine was about, the influence of Brecht and how that might have worked with, the influence of local forms and wanting to bring in local forms and the introduction of Habib Tanir. You answered it brilliantly. So, I mean, if we could talk more about it. But
the words are getting slurred. Can you repeat
Sorry.
the question if there's a question?
No, it wasn't a question. I already asked it. So you've answered it already is what I was saying. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here we have another question from Shubhankar. So sir, just explain the interaction between the urban and the rural theatre through Tanveer. But here is another question, which is an allied question. So Shubhankar is asking, could you please elaborate on the coexistence between the rural theatre, in many cases the local community theatre, and the urban theatre in the colonial times? And what are the parallels or the dialogues that existed in this period?
Now, one important thing that I left out because of time constraint, but maybe if I bring that in, that will show you the interaction and the connections. Now, I'll give 2 instances. These are the 2 major parallel instances from the East and the West. Now, in the colonial period, as I said, that the first exercises in theatre, in urban theatre, were exercises in which the colonial rulers, the British, who were trying to make overtures to the natives and trying to make connections, useful connections for their administration, for their purpose, for the political purpose. Now, in that process of a of the artifice of sharing, the artifice of intercommunication, the Parsi theatre came into being in Bombay. The Parsi theatre had nothing to do with Parsi culture as such, which is a very, very rich, complex culture, and with several layers from the Persian to the Indian. It was Parsi investment. And in the initial Parsi investment, the idea was to make plays out of Indian history, Indian mythology, urban Indian stories, but offer them to the colonials, offer them to the master class as our sentiments, our feelings. Look at our life. We are giving you our life, which you can study and you can know better for yourselves. That was the beginning. But then with Parsi investment and the business acumen that they brought to it, as in various other fields, this intermingling of culture and industry, which have been so much part of the Parsi history in India. The Parsi theatre became a traveling theatre. So a play opens maybe in Bombay, has 20 performances, and that's enough for the audience that's there for this kind of theatre. And then they start traveling, and they travel from Bombay down to Karnataka, into Kerala, crossing the borders between Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Kerala. They have common borders, as you know. And in this process, at one point of time, what the Parsi theatre started doing is they were setting up, with some local investment, local support, a very intelligent business operation, I would say, small theatres. So if you travel that entire route from Bombay down to Karnataka, through Dharwad, and into Kerala, you will see this whole network, a chain of small theatres, 400-seater, 450-seater. And in the process of the same play traveling, written in a easy mix of Hindi and Urdu initially, but as it travels through these different areas, the language becomes simpler, and takes on ideas, episodes, politics, stories from the interiors, from these regions, even from local regional forms. A song or a dance or a skit would be taken over, so that you create a kind of an all-Indian audience. The Parsi theatre would also travel to Calcutta and set up a theatre called the Moonlight Theatre in Calcutta. Now, this was one way, one route along which the urban theatre and the local theatres, I'm deliberately not using the term folk, that has other problematics, but the local theatre, the local regional theatres, these were getting mixed, and one is working with these elements. So this became a trend, and it was the Parsi theatre which would also influence the Yakshagana in Karnataka, which was a local theatre form, but it can take in things as items, as parts, as elements from different traditions at ease. It was also the Marathi Tamasha. So there were these forms, these portmanteau forms, I would call them, which can accommodate various kinds of elements, often quite alien, but it allows this overallity. The same thing happened in the East with the Jatra, where the urban theatre and local forms, even local languages, these could be brought together and combined and mixed. And the Jatra, which began predominantly in Bengal, not in Calcutta, but in small towns, district towns in eastern Bengal. But in the 1920s, they came to have their offices, their headquarters in Calcutta, the major Jatra companies. And they were catering not just to a Bengali audience, a Bengali speaking audience, but catering to Orissa, Assam, where Assam would develop out of the Bengali Jatra its own traveling theatre. So these continuities, one rolling into the other, there's a very rich history of that.
Again, thank you, sir. So we have a slightly different question. So there are a few allied questions, but I'm just kind of skimming through and picking up questions which are
So,
slightly different.
Anparna,
Yeah.
maybe just one more question, because
Yes.
Sir
Yes.
has been talking for a long time. I
Sure.
think,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure.
So just one more question.
So maybe I was thinking maybe I could actually take
This,
Rinhon's
this,
question. Yes, Santara?
yeah, you go on. I just noticed this question about theatre studies, and
Yes.
thought, but
Yeah,
you
this is another question on adaptation. So I was just thinking maybe we should take the question of adaptation,
Okay.
given that it was very central.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
I am Kartikeya Sharma. Actually, I had posted the first question.
So, see, we are sort of taking, if you want to ask, go ahead, you can ask the
Yeah.
question. But the thing
Yes,
is,
ma'am.
we are moderating the question. So, yes, if you want to go ahead and ask, please go ahead.
Ma'am, I want to ask this question that the movie, do the movies like Pariksha, Angrezi Medium, and Super 30 directly are they directly related to the motto of IPTA? This is my question.
I haven't seen these films. I'm sorry.
Thank you, sir.
So yes, the question of adaptation. So we know that in the be it Nandikar, be it Bohurupi, they have also, apart from their original productions, they have of course adapted, translated, and kind of several of these European plays from Ibsen to Beckett. So we have a question from Rindhon, who is asking us that my question is, do you think that adaptation of modern European theatre has become one of the driving forces in modern Indian theatre?
Um, I wouldn't say that it has been a driving force, in the sense that if you really come to think, more late 19th century or early 20th century plays have been adapted most of the time. There's nothing wrong in it. We have come back to them. We have come back to Ibsen again and again. We have gone back to Strindberg, to Chekhov. But we have had some Dario Fo and Frank Arame, of course. But have we had enough, really, of adaptations from the present European or even the British playwrights? We haven't had much of Edward Bond or Tom Stoppard or Harold Pinter or even Beckett, not enough. So I don't think that adaptations have been a driving force. In fact, in the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s, I would say that there was a kind of an compulsive dependence on these plays. We don't have our own playwrights. We don't have playwrights addressing our immediate issues enough. So let's take a foreign play and turn it to our needs and turn it to our requirements. A lot of that was done. But I think right at the moment, as far as I know, more original plays are being written in the languages. But it's unfortunate that the natural, spontaneous exchange of plays and traveling of plays, texts and performances alike, throughout India, which was happening in the last century, has somehow, all the reasons are not clear to me, frankly, have been curbed. We have a state program the National School of Drama runs the Bharat Rang Mahotsav, and it is an official, state-controlled, institutionalized affair where through a centralized selection process, and I've been part of this process at one time, and at one point I decided that I would opt out of it. I would have nothing to do with it because of the different kinds of controls and politics that goes into it. So we don't see a lot of the plays that are taking place all over India, in the big cities, metropolises, and small cities, even small towns. I occasionally get opportunities in Bengal, and I've had opportunities also of watching a lot of plays in Karnataka because I've been a regular visitor to the Ninasam culture course in Hegadu for the last 20 years. So I've seen a lot of Kannada plays and plays from very small places in Karnataka. The quality, the theatrical values, and the plays are original, written out of their own experiences. But we have so little exposure to these plays that we don't have any right, we do not have any authority to speak in theoretical terms about this whole experience of the great spread of theatre. And foreign plays adaptations are not the driving force. It's one element, of course, a very rich element, no question of that, but not the driving force.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. So I think we have a couple of other questions, but for that, I think we need another talk. So those are about new directions in theatre studies. So maybe we should invite you for another talk. But I would request now Antora to kind of take over and maybe formally
Yes,
conclude
I
the
think,
session,
yeah.
please.
Thank you everybody for those questions, and I'm afraid we couldn't take all of them, but it's been a long time, and I think we really need to give the speaker a break now. And we will definitely have Sir for another follow-up talk at some point, and where we can discuss all of these different trajectories in greater detail. So thank you so much, sir, for that very, very rich and comprehensive lecture on the growth and development of modern Indian theatre from the colonial times and to all the post-colonial contestations, all the regional variations, all the currents that came and impacted the development of this very rich and thriving domains, and all of these different trajectories which Indian theatre took from the 1940s till the latter part of the 20th century. So I think definitely this is only the beginning of a discussion, and we would definitely like to have another sequel to this at some point. But I think we can end today's lecture here with a very warm thank you to Sir and the audience, and to Nimidi once more. So I think we'll end here, and thank you, Anuparna, for moderating the Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Such a
Thank you.
scintillating journey.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a very good evening. Thank you.
Good evening.